kid's fathers weren't really there. I'm a good man. I felt like that was a role I was gonna have to take on if I wanted to be with her.
You got spooked when you found out that your ex-girlfriend, Miss Johnson, cheated with a man she worked with at a haunted house. Forced Mr. Streety to sign Zeandre's birth certificate.
You know, I was foolish at the time. In the beginning, it was the way I felt about her. When we first met, she was already pregnant. Yeah, plus their older siblings too.
And the older sibling. You signed the birth certificate for a child you knew wasn't yours.
Yes, Your Honor. I know.
So how many children do you have between the two of you?
One.
The other one you're on the birth certificate, but you're not the biological father, but you have 2 other children besides that.
And I would say he was still involved with someone else because he was receiving phone calls and he was like very suspicious about it. That was the game plan after he got
okay,
there.
so you told her, I'm gonna go to Denver first. So now the first thing we really need to understand is, why do you doubt?
This court case unfolds under the authority of Judge Lauren Lake, where the focus is not spectacle but accountability. The description centers on what happens inside the courtroom as multiple individuals come forward, each carrying emotional weight tied to paternity, relationships, and legal responsibility. At its core, the matter is about a DNA test, the consequences people regret taking too late, and how truth changes everything once scientific evidence replaces suspicion. The first dispute brought before the court is a divorce-adjacent paternity conflict, where a man challenges his legal status as a father after learning of infidelity. On the evidence stage, he explains that although he signed the birth certificate willingly, later discoveries about cheating stories, specifically involving a coworker from a haunted house, triggered deep insecurity. The court examines not just biology, but intent, timing, and responsibility. Judge Lauren Lake carefully dissects the timeline, weighing testimony against factual consistency, illustrating the relationship between law and justice rather than emotional impulse. The courtroom is filled with people whose lives intersect around one child. The mother asserts honesty, claiming she disclosed her actions when asked. The alleged father insists doubt arose from circumstances that made him question conception timing. This tension highlights a recurring theme in DNA test people regret taking cases. Once doubt is voiced, it cannot be undone, even if the results confirm biological truth. The court explains that voluntary actions, such as signing a birth certificate, carry legal consequences independent of DNA outcomes, reinforcing principles drawn from the concept of justice in jurisprudence. When DNA results are presented, the atmosphere shifts. The truth does not simply answer a question, it reshapes responsibility. The man is confirmed as the biological father, proving that suspicion alone is insufficient to escape accountability. Judge Lake emphasizes that trust, once broken, creates legal and emotional damage that no test can fully repair. This moment mirrors discussions often heard on the Truth Changes Everything podcast and the Game Changing Attorney podcast, where legal facts collide with personal regret. The case then transitions to a second dispute involving multiple children and overlapping relationships. Here, the courtroom examines repeated cycles of denial and confrontation. A mother seeks acknowledgement and child support, while the alleged father claims certainty that DNA results will absolve him. The court listens as accusations of manipulation, avoidance, and irresponsible behavior surface. This segment reflects adverse inference in Evidence Act principles, where behavior surrounding evidence collection itself becomes relevant to credibility. Witnesses are called not to dramatize events, but to clarify patterns. Family members describe suspicious actions during prior testing, raising questions about integrity. Judge Lake redirects focus to procedure, explaining how proper DNA testing works and why speculation cannot override certified results. The court underscores that scientific evidence is neutral. It does not favor emotion, anger, or convenience. When results reveal the man is not the father of one child, but is the biological father of another, the courtroom confronts the complexity of modern family structures. The presence of another man who stepped in as a caregiver introduces themes common in adoption stories' full episodes, where emotional fatherhood and biological fatherhood diverge. Judge Lake acknowledges the role of caregiving, but clarifies that biology determines legal obligation unless otherwise altered by law. The discussion expands into broader issues of responsibility. The court addresses repeated cycles of denial followed by renewed relationships, resulting in further paternity disputes. This pattern reflects why many stories featured in Celebrate Recovery testimonies and the Divorce Course podcast emphasize accountability as a form of healing rather than punishment. Judge Lake stresses that children are not collateral damage in adult conflict. A third case brings forward financial claims tied directly to paternity confirmation. A mother presents documented expenses, placing the matter firmly on the evidence stage. Receipts, timelines, and testimony illustrate how raising children without support compounds hardship. The alleged father's dismissive attitude becomes central to the court's analysis, demonstrating how behavior influences judicial outcomes beyond DNA alone. Judge Lauren Lake draws attention to the relationship between law and justice, explaining that fairness does not mean avoiding responsibility, but meeting it fully once established. The DNA results confirm paternity for both children, triggering legal consequences including backdated financial judgments and ongoing child support obligations. This mirrors outcomes often discussed in Supreme Court child support analyses, where parental duty is framed as non-negotiable once established. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom remains a place where truth is extracted methodically, not emotionally. The judge repeatedly reframes arguments away from insults and toward legal facts. The cases collectively illustrate why DNA test cheating stories resonate so strongly with audiences. They expose how personal decisions ripple outward into legal, financial, and emotional realities. By the end, the court does not celebrate victory or defeat. Instead, it delivers resolution. Each ruling reinforces that doubt without evidence is insufficient, that biology carries weight in law, and that stepping into a parental role, whether voluntarily or biologically, demands consistency. Judge Lake's final remarks emphasize breaking cycles of neglect, aligning closely with themes explored in recovery-based legal discussions and public education platforms. This courtroom narrative ultimately demonstrates how the justice system navigates deeply personal disputes using structured reasoning, scientific verification, and legal precedent. It is not simply about who is the father, but about how truth, once revealed, forces individuals to confront responsibility, repair harm, and redefine their role in a child's life. The courtroom proceedings continue by widening the lens beyond individual accusations and focusing on how repeated doubt erodes stability for everyone involved. Judge Lauren Lake makes it clear that this court is not a place for emotional escape, but for resolution grounded in law. Each party is reminded that when a case reaches the evidence stage, personal narratives must give way to verifiable facts. This framework defines the remaining disputes, where unresolved trust issues intersect with legal responsibility. In the next matter, the court examines how ongoing relationships, marked by inconsistency and denial, create recurring paternity conflicts. The individuals before the bench acknowledge long-term involvement with one another, yet resist accountability once children are born. This pattern reflects why many participants in DNA test people regret taking stories express remorse, not because the test exists, but because it exposes truths they attempted to avoid. Judge Lake emphasizes that a DNA test does not create responsibility. it merely reveals it. The testimony illustrates how doubt often becomes a tool rather than a genuine concern. One party repeatedly cites character judgments, alleging promiscuity and deception, while simultaneously admitting to years of intimate involvement. The court challenges this contradiction directly, underscoring that the concept of justice in jurisprudence requires consistency between actions and claims. You cannot deny responsibility while benefiting from the relationship that produced the child. As financial claims are presented, the courtroom shifts into a more structured legal analysis. Receipts, timelines, and documented expenses are reviewed methodically. Judge Lake explains that child-related costs, diapers, formula, medical needs, are not optional luxuries but necessities. This discussion aligns with broader legal principles often explored in Supreme Court child support cases, where courts consistently affirm that financial duty follows biological confirmation, regardless of personal grievances. The judge also addresses behavior that attempts to undermine credibility rather than engage with facts. Insults and deflection are identified as distractions from the core issue, whether the children have a legally recognized father. Here, Judge Lake introduces the idea that courts may consider patterns of avoidance when evaluating claims, echoing doctrines similar to adverse inference in Evidence Act reasoning. When someone consistently evades responsibility, their doubt becomes less persuasive. Another DNA result confirms biological fatherhood, shifting the conversation from denial to obligation. The court makes clear that once truth is established, the focus must move forward. Judge Lake stresses that accountability is not punishment, it is protection for the child. This moment mirrors discussions featured on the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where the revelation of truth forces a decisive turning point rather than prolonged conflict. The proceedings further explore emotional consequences for children caught between adults. Judge Lake repeatedly reminds the courtroom that children interpret absence as rejection, not legal nuance. This reflection ties closely to themes found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where breaking generational cycles of abandonment requires conscious responsibility rather than repeated excuses. The court frames parental duty as both legal and moral, reinforcing the relationship between law and justice. As another case unfolds, the court addresses nomming disputes and symbolic gestures used during conflict. A child being named after someone other than the biological father becomes a point of contention. Judge Lake clarifies that names, while emotionally significant, do not override biological reality. This explanation resonates with viewers familiar with adoption stories' full episodes, where identity, caregiving, and biology intersect, but remain legally distinct unless formally redefined. The courtroom also examines how repeated sexual relationships during periods of uncertainty complicate claims of doubt. Judge Lake questions why intimacy continued if certainty was lacking, highlighting the contradiction between behavior and testimony. This line of reasoning underscores a recurring lesson in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast. Credibility is shaped not only by what is said, but by what is consistently done. Financial responsibility becomes unavoidable as judgments are issued. Backdated support is awarded based on documented expenses, reinforcing that delay does not erase obligation. Judge Lake explains that courts cannot ignore years of unsupported parenting simply because acknowledgement arrives late. This reinforces public understanding of how child support operates within established legal frameworks. The tone of the courtroom remains firm but instructive. Judge Lake addresses both parents, explaining that disrespect between adults teaches children harmful lessons. The court positions itself not merely as an enforcer of rules, but as a boundary-setting institution designed to protect those without power. This philosophy aligns with broader educational discussions found in the Divorce Course podcast, where legal structure is presented as a stabilizing force rather than an adversary. As the session progresses, repeated DNA confirmations leave little room for denial. Each ruling builds on the last, reinforcing the idea that truth, once revealed, demands action. The court does not entertain selective acceptance of results. Either the science is trusted or the process collapses. This reinforces why DNA test cheating stories often end with reluctant acceptance rather than celebration. Judge Lauren Lake concludes these matters by emphasizing forward movement. The court cannot repair emotional damage, but it can establish clear responsibility. Parents are instructed to meet their obligations consistently, both financially and emotionally. The judge highlights that compliance is not about winning or losing a case, but about ensuring children receive stability. These proceedings collectively demonstrate how the justice system handles deeply personal disputes with structured reasoning. Each case reinforces that doubt without evidence cannot outweigh scientific verification, and that responsibility follows truth inevitably. The courtroom becomes a space where denial ends and accountability begins, illustrating how law functions not as punishment, but as a framework for protecting children and restoring order once uncertainty is resolved. This continuation of the courtroom narrative further solidifies the central lesson. When truth changes everything, the law ensures that responsibility follows, regardless of regret, resentment, or delayed acceptance. As the courtroom session moves toward its conclusion, Judge Lauren Lake brings the focus back to the underlying purpose of every ruling delivered that day. The court is not merely resolving disputes between adults. It is establishing certainty where confusion has lingered, and structure where instability has harmed children. Each case presented reinforces why the evidence stage is essential in family court, especially in matters involving a DNA test, where emotions alone cannot dictate outcomes. Judge Lake emphasizes that many people enter court believing a test will free them from responsibility, only to become part of the growing number of DNA test people regret taking cases. The regret does not stem from the science itself, but from the false hope that truth can be negotiated. In reality, once biological facts are confirmed, the law responds decisively. This is where the phrase often repeated in legal commentary, "Truth changes everything" podcast, becomes a lived experience rather than a slogan. The court revisits how doubt is frequently introduced long after a child is born, often following relationship breakdowns. Judge Lake explains that timing matters. When a parent has already assumed a role, signing birth certificates, living with the child, or presenting themselves publicly as a parent, the law weighs those actions heavily. This principle reflects the deeper concept of justice in jurisprudence, where responsibility is measured not only by biology but by conduct and intent. In addressing financial accountability, the court reiterates that child support is not a penalty imposed on one parent, but a right belonging to the child. Judge Lake explains how courts calculate responsibility based on need, not resentment. These explanations echo widely discussed standards seen in Supreme Court child support interpretations, where the child's welfare consistently overrides adult conflict. The courtroom makes it clear that avoidance only increases long-term consequences. The judge also confronts repeated patterns of disrespect and deflection. Attempts to discredit mothers through character attacks are identified as irrelevant to paternity determination. Judge Lake explains that courts do not adjudicate morality, they adjudicate facts. This distinction highlights the relationship between law and justice, showing how legal systems separate personal judgment from legal obligation to reach fair outcomes. Another critical issue addressed is how repeated intimacy undermines claims of uncertainty. Judge Lake explains that courts consider consistency of behavior when evaluating credibility. Continuing a sexual relationship while later denying paternity weakens arguments of doubt. This reasoning aligns closely with principles often discussed on the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal outcomes are shown to hinge on patterns rather than isolated statements. As the final DNA confirmations are read, the courtroom atmosphere shifts from confrontation to inevitability. Science closes the door on speculation. Judge Lake makes it clear that selective acceptance of DNA results is not an option. Either the process is trusted fully, or doubt has no place in court. This reinforces why DNA test cheating stories often conclude not with relief, but with accountability. The court then addresses the emotional consequences for children whose paternity has been publicly questioned. Judge Lake explains that children internalize instability, even when too young to understand legal details. This observation connects to broader social discussions found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where breaking cycles of abandonment begins with adults taking responsibility rather than repeating harmful patterns. Judge Lake also clarifies misconceptions surrounding caregiving versus biological fatherhood. While emotional bonds and caregiving roles are deeply valued, they do not override biological findings unless formal legal steps, such as adoption, are taken. This explanation parallels themes explored in Adoption Stories full episodes, where love, responsibility, and legal status intersect but remain distinct without court action. Nomming disputes are addressed with similar clarity. Judge Lake explains that names, while symbolically powerful, do not determine legal fatherhood. Attempting to use nomming as leverage or proof is rejected. The court reiterates that the evidence stage relies on verified documentation and certified testing, not symbolic gestures made during conflict. As judgments are finalized, Judge Lake turns attention to the long-term implications of noncompliance. Parents are warned that continued avoidance may result in enforcement actions, wage garnishment, or further legal consequences. The court stresses that compliance is not optional once responsibility is established. These warnings reflect established enforcement mechanisms discussed widely in legal education platforms, including the Divorce Course podcast. Judge Lake also addresses the broader social responsibility of parents. Children learn relationship norms by observation. When disrespect, denial, or instability dominate adult behavior, those lessons are absorbed. The court frames accountability as an opportunity to correct course, not simply fulfill legal requirements. This reinforces the court's role as both an enforcer of law and a protector of future well-being. The judge concludes by reminding all parties that court decisions are final, but pathways forward remain open. Co-parenting, counseling, and structured agreements are encouraged where possible. However, the court makes it clear that emotional healing cannot replace legal duty. Responsibility must come first. Reconciliation, if it happens, comes later. In summarizing the proceedings, the courtroom stands as a place where uncertainty ends. Each case demonstrates that denial may delay resolution, but it cannot prevent it. The repeated presence of doubt only amplifies consequences once truth is confirmed. Judge Lake's rulings collectively illustrate how law functions as a stabilizing force when personal relationships fail. This final segment reinforces the central message carried through every case. The justice system does not exist to validate fear or insecurity. It exists to establish truth and enforce responsibility. Whether welcomed or resisted, that truth reshapes lives permanently. In these cases, the court ensures that once truth is revealed, children are no longer left in limbo, and accountability replaces uncertainty.